Hey, detoxers. When Donald Trump ran for president in 2024, part of his appeal to some supporters was that he promised to protect free speech and reestablish some of the basic freedoms and liberties they claimed were lost under President Biden. However, recently, Trump supporters such as Joe Rogan have voiced concern that the Trump administration is not living up to these commitments. Today, we'll investigate the contradictions and hypocrisies of Trump 2.0 as it relates to basic freedoms and liberties in the United States. I have with me Robin Andersen and Steve Macek, no strangers to these topics. Welcome both of you to the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks for having us, Nolan.
It's great to be here.
Robin, why don't I go ahead and start with you? In particular, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how conservatives, at least I remember, I'm old enough to remember 10 or 15 years ago when conservatives were really angered at liberals on campuses for shutting down free speech and shutting down speakers. But now we've had these interesting cases under the Trump administration. You want to kind of unpack that for the audience?
Sure. First of all, I think I recommend the Jon Stewart takedown of the Republicans and Trump freedom of speech. And he puts this wonderful footage together of Fox News hosts and the things they're saying about the left in terms of their Orwellian, and we should be scared, very scared.
Conservatives have been very concerned about the loss of free speech in our country for a very long time.
Bullies on the left aiming to silence conservatives.
Free speech is under siege in this country.
Federal immigration officials arrested a Palestinian activist who helped lead last year's student encampment protest at Columbia.
I think we ought to get them all out of the country. They're troublemakers. They're agitators.
I think what they meant was, we want our freedom of speech, and we don't want anybody else to have freedom of speech. Having said that, of course, the shot across the bow at the beginning of March, of course, was March 8th, when DHS agents picked up Malcolm Khalid in front of his Columbia-owned home after he had just finished his graduate degree in international public affairs, and Trump and everybody went online and say, we're protecting Jewish students on campus. We don't like what he says. He's anti-Semitic. He's pro-Hamas. He's a terrorist. And we can see when we talk through this program, I think, Nolan, how it goes from Gaza as the primary starting point and real motivation behind the closing down of freedom of speech in America, and how it has moved into being now the charge is anti-American, anti-governmental, and bad for American foreign policy, and stuff like that. And really, what Mahmoud did was actually without a face cover, and that's why they could identify him. He protested. And he also negotiated. He has a history of being a negotiator. He worked for the British in Beirut, the British Home Office in Beirut, working on Syria educational programs and other things. So he's, by all accounts, a very mild-mannered person, loved by all he works with. So therefore, calling him a terrorist and pro-Hamas is kind of the height of defamation. And it kind of all starts from there. And it really starts from that horrible videotape that his wife Noor took of him being, abducted, kidnapped. Media have called it arrested. They didn't have an arrest warrant. And we can kind of go from there to the other things that have been happening on American campuses.
Steve, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, so for your viewers / listeners information, I am vice president of the Illinois State Conference of the American Association of University Professors. We're an organization that is devoted to protecting academic freedom, tenure, and academic due process. And we are very, very alarmed as an organization nationally, both nationally and at the state level, about what is happening, the stifling of dissent on college campuses, specifically targeting students and faculty who are engaged in speech that is critical of Israel and is sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and sympathetic especially to the beleaguered Palestinians in Gaza. Here in the state of Illinois, we have seen a ramping up of attacks against anyone who dares to utter a word of criticism against Zionism or against Israel. So I'll give you two examples that I've been sort of intimately familiar with in my role as vice president of the Illinois State Conference of the AUP. At Northwestern University, Stephen Thrasher, who's a professor of journalism, he writes about like public health issues and media coverage of public health, among other things. Last spring, attended a protest at a protest encampment against the assault on Gaza. And when police were arriving to break up that protest, he physically, along with four other faculty, grad students, and staff, put themselves in between the protesters, the student protesters, and the police. The police arrested them, but no charges were filed at the time. Then, fast forward to this summer, you remember that the Republicans in Congress started holding these kangaroo court hearings, calling onto the carpet presidents of colleges and universities, asking them what they were doing to combat anti-Semitism. Of course, what they meant by that was what they're doing to combat pro-Palestinian protests, because there's no evidence at all that the protesters who are calling out the brutal violence being committed against Palestinians were anti-Semitic. In fact, the majority of the students at some demonstrations were Jewish and were members of groups like Jewish Voices for Peace. So he at one of those hearings, a House hearing, a Republican representative from Indiana asked the president of Northwestern if that thug, Stephen Thatcher, was still working for Northwestern and still teaching for Northwestern. Then, a few days later, charges were brought against him. He had no charges brought against him. Charges were brought against him for interfering with the police, dispersing of the protest back in the spring. And then later, the state's attorney dropped the charges because they were totally specious and there's no way they could get them to stick. But nevertheless, Stephen Thrasher was suspended for 2 quarters from teaching without any kind of due process. That's one case. I could talk about others, but I know time is short. But we are very concerned that administrations are kowtowing to the pressure that is coming from Republicans in Congress. It's primarily Republicans, but not only, from Republicans in Congress and from the Trump administration, and are flagrantly violating the academic freedom of their faculty, of their students, and their staff. What happened at Columbia, is absolutely atrocious. Where Columbia decided that they were going to make changes to their own media studies program in response to pressure that was brought by the administration, because the administration was threatening to withhold something like $400 million in federal funding.
On university campuses, they have long been the site for critical reasoning, for students to come together with faculty and understand how the world is working, the economics, the history, everything that brought us to a certain point. When you're studying social justice or economics or DEI, which they're now kind of dismantling. 41 universities and colleges around the country have basically dismantled their diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculums based on Trump's, and I think wrongly, but we can get back to that. But the university is a site of learning. It's a site where faculty have the right to design curriculum, where they are. I would tell my students when I was teaching a little while ago that the university is the last place where we actually have freedom of expression and speech. It's a place of learning and faculty development and faculty decision making at the departmental and university level. And what Trump is, so the whole anti-Semitism being thrown around now for higher education. The real purpose is to demoralize and dismantle higher education in the United States, because the purpose of higher education stands in a very stark conflict to what Trump world is. And that Trump world is based on a paranoid imagination. It's an obsession with disinformation and false statements, which we've heard him say over and over again. And it's immune to refutation by evidence and reason. Um, in contrast, universities function in university colleges are also sites of scientific and medical research dealing with issues like climate change and vaccines and fact based studies about history and economies. You can't have it politicized. It's largely to date. It has not been politicized in the way that they want it to be politicized now. I think the last final word on this came from Rashid Khalidi, who's who's really mad as the Edward Said professor at Columbia of how Columbia has so quickly uh, given in and just dismantled its program, taking what he points out um, unprecedented and unconstitutional actions that are targeted at Jewish professors and Jewish students as much as anybody for political gain, using an instrumentalization and weaponizing of anti-Semitism. And I think the best one that speaks about this, another one, is David Mayer from at UCLA, a Jewish professor who teaches Jewish history, and he said Trump allies are really interested in bringing the university to its knees as a way of removing a key liberal progressive actor in the American political game, and they want to get rid of that. Rashid has said similar things. He's called it Vichy on the Hudson, Columbia, and does it really deserve to be called a university anymore? So as universities just buckle under what are unconstitutional demands and not based in law, we're moving closer and closer to an authoritarian, totalitarian type situation in this country.
It seems to me for about, I don't know, last 30 or 40 years, we saw a lot of like centrist, kind of, for lack of a better word, like neoliberal Democrats running the administration of higher ed. And I think they used a lot of DEI language to justify corporate policies that left a lot of people angered and frustrated with the university. And I think that kind of ceded some ground where conservatives have some substantive critiques mixed with a bunch of nonsense. But it's the other flip side of that coin, before Republicans get excited for what I said, is that today it seems like, Robin, you're describing just what kind of liberals did with using DEI to deconstruct higher ed as we know it. It seems like conservatives are doing a version of that with the anti-Semitism agenda. It's not really about combating anti-Semitism. Like, I would argue a lot of the corporate DEI policies were not really about advancing DEI.
Right.
Steve, you want to jump in?
Their notion of anti-Semitism is highly controversial, and it's the one that was part of that Trump declared in an executive order in his first term, right? He made an executive order on anti-Semitism, and he embraced a definition of anti-Semitism that is highly contentious and most Jews in America would reject, which suggests that any criticism of Israel is by definition anti-Semitic. Most Jews in America are to the left of on the political spectrum, and they would reject categorically the idea that any criticism of Israel is. Now, they may be supporting Israel in this current conflict with Gaza for whatever reason, but they would reject that definition of anti-Semitism, and that is the one that the Homeland Security and so on is trying to enforce by stripping these graduate students and students who are here on student visas of their student visas. It is it's kind of ridiculous. But I want to get back to something that you mentioned, Nolan, which is something I agree with. I think there has been for at least a couple of decades an enormous amount of frustration with colleges and universities. But I actually think it doesn't really have much to do with DEI. I think the frustration with colleges and universities is over the rising cost of higher education. And this has everything to do with the divestment, right, by both the federal government, but especially because most higher ed institutions, most public higher ed institutions are funded by state funds, especially at the state level, the subsidy for higher education, which used to be embraced as a bipartisan issue, right? But Republicans and Democrats both understood that this had broad benefits for society to fund the kind of research and teaching that goes on in universities, had broad benefits for society. And once the neoliberal, the neoliberal ideology took hold at the state level, they decided, oh, we're going to push the cost of education off onto the individual student and their families. We're going to cut back on the subsidy that we provide. And that led to a couple of things. First, the increase in tuition costs has spiraled out of control and has made it, higher ed, increasingly unaffordable for working class students in particular. And second, it created this student loan crisis where instead of having grants and scholarships that students having grants and scholarships they could use to go to college, they had to rely on federally guaranteed student loans and had to go deeply and deeply in debt. And of course, we saw the outcry from people who had become incredibly indebted during the Occupy movement, right? When the banks on Wall Street got bailed out, but students who were holding, tens of millions, tens and hundreds, billions of dollars in student loans got no relief.
And I want to return to this due process question as well. And I'm probably butchering it, but I've been reminded of that old quote about, right, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't do
Right.
the socialists, and then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't do anything because I'm not a trade unionist, and then they came for the Jews, and I didn't do anything because I'm not Jewish, and then they came for me, and there was nobody.
There's nobody that left. Yeah.
So with that quote in mind, Robin, you at the start of this podcast, you talked a little bit about some of the specific cases, and we didn't really get into the due process element. And I think this is kind of missing from the discussion, regardless of whether or not you love or hate these people, or you think their viewpoint is great or horrible, or you like what they did or didn't. That is all irrelevant to me. Due process, I think, needs to be a central part of the conversation. The media is really missing that. They're too fixated on the individual or Israel, Gaza. Can you talk a little bit about how due process was ignored in some of the situations you've been looking at in your research, and why you think it's important to have due process? Which I apologize that I have to ask you that question in 2025, but that's where we're at. That I have to ask you that question.
When they abducted Mahmoud Khalil, they had no arrest warrant, so they hadn't charged him with anything. They immediately took him within 24 hours, first to New Jersey, then to Louisiana to an ICE detention center where they threw him on the floor with one blanket. So fast action by the Center for Constitutional Rights with a coalition of a lot of lawyers. I think I've heard up to 19. They immediately put in for, you can't deport him right away, because what Trump is doing with this, he's merging two kind of very different phenomenon that he's working on. And one is he wants to get rid of all of the immigrants. And the second is he wants to close down the universities and get rid of the students who dared to protest the war against Palestinians and the genocide in Gaza. So I don't think it's an accident that they started with students who are either on visas or permanent residents. Now, it was so telling in the tape that the agents on the other side of the phone did not know that he was a permanent resident, and they said, "You don't have a student visa." Well, the student visa is under the purview of the executive branch. They have a way. They have enormous powers to deny visas, and particularly if you come in from in an airplane, or if you come in if you don't have a green card, and even if you do, they can really do things to you at the border. So that is where you have the less and less due process. What CCR did is halt his immediate deportation from Louisiana, Mahmoud Khalil, and they demanded that they bring the case back to New York City. They were going to do all of this. They were going to simply put him on a plane without a legal intervention. And that's what we're talking about due process. They were going to disappear him before he had the right to be seen in court, which, of course, every American citizen has the right. He, as a resident, has the right to freedom of speech and to be seen in a court. And he has the right to due process. So that's what they are evading. The other, poor young woman from Turkey who is studying at Tufts was taken off the streets of Boston. What did she do? She wrote one op-ed piece in the school newspaper with a friend criticizing Israel for Gaza and saying that they've stopped medical aid, food, and water in Gaza. A true statement. What can happen is that people working for Canary Mission or other Israeli lobbyists and Better USA now, they can see you on Facebook or social media. They can they'll start to tag you. They'll start making lists, and then they will go to your place of employment. And that's how this is happening. This is not happening because the Trump administration has incredibly interesting data and they're going through judiciously and looking at who really deserves to be here and who doesn't. No, they're taking their cues from Canary Mission and another new lobbyist on the block called Better USA, which was formed in 1923 by basically a fascist who loved Mussolini, who adopted fascist symbols, and they're very kind of violent, and they're the ones who have taken credit for compiling thousands of names that they've given to the Trump administrations to get rid of them.
The theme of this episode is the contradictions, and Robin and Steve, you guys were talking about how there's these institutions or organizations that keep these lists of people who then are targeted. That sounds really cancel culture-ish, which I thought the right wing was, very fixated on ending this idea.
I mean, that was always bogus. What we're facing right now is a crisis in institutions that formerly were devoted to protecting the truth and spreading knowledge and public enlightenment, right? One is the university and the other is the media. Now, the media has never performed that role. The corporate media has never performed that role really well, or I guess I should say they've performed that role inconsistently over the years. They've had a few shining moments like Watergate and so on, but then other moments where they have failed miserably. But what's happening right now is, the Trump administration, Trump has never made a secret of the fact that he despises journalism and he despises the news media. In his first campaign, he called journalists enemies of the people. And he throughout his first term as president, denounced leading news organizations, CNN, Washington Post, the New York Times, as perpetuating fake news. He's already said that he's not going to appeal the defeat of network neutrality rules. So network neutrality is dead. And that's going to mean that these big internet service providers like Verizon and Comcast can start charging internet content providers to prioritize their content online. I mean, so they're going to do everything possible to turn the electronic media into a playground of the oligarchs, which it already is, to make it even more a playground of the oligarchs. And it's to punish companies that Carr and MAGA view as enemies of Donald Trump. It's very clear that that's what's going to happen.
So that sounds like another hypocrisy contradiction there, right? They didn't want the government dictating what could be on platforms or in news media, but here's the government dictating what's on platforms.
Platforms and news media, right? No, exactly. No, I mean, that's a very blatant contradiction. Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Robin, did you want to jump in on that?
I wanted to say that the White House Correspondents' Dinner is emblematic, I think, of also what we're talking about. So they extended an invitation to the comedian Amber Ruffin and for the dinner, and very quickly after that rescinded it. So she's not going to be the speaker or the comedian. There will be no comedian at all. And they said it was to ensure the focus is not on the politics of division, but entirely on awarding our colleagues for their outstanding work. Now, if you think about censoring their chosen speaker, who said she was not, not going to tell both sides of the story because there wasn't both sides. There's only one. There's one side to reality, and if you think about this organization, and the profession, it's very profession is based on the assumption of the First Amendment. Their mission is to actually bring knowledge to the public's right to know, and it's about freedom of expression. So by buckling to this because they're afraid of Donald Trump, um, is such a not only is it an indication of the times, but if we look back at some of the Correspondents' Dinner, if you think of, does anybody remember Stephen Colbert in
Oh
2000?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow, what an honor. The White House Correspondents' Dinner. To actually, to sit here at the same table with my hero, George W. Bush. I believe the government that governs best is the government that governs least. And by these standards, we have set up a fabulous government in Iraq. Listen, let's review the rules. Here's how it works. The president makes decisions. He's the decider. The press secretary announces those decisions, and you people of the press type those decisions down. Make, announce, type. Just put them through a spell check and go home. Get to know your family again. Make love to your wife. Write that novel you got kicking around in your head. You know, the one about the intrepid Washington reporter with the courage to stand up to the administration? You know, fiction.
I mean, it was amazing stuff. And the 2017 dinner was also disrupted because Trump's new term. So media too is a site of struggle, but they're worried that they're not going to be invited into the White House press corps. They're not going to have access to all of the people that they need to put on their screens that are going to say a bunch of nonsense.
Well, and of course, since you mentioned, their need for access, right? Trump banned the reporters from the Associated Press from covering the White House for the most petty reason possible, because they will not call the body of water south of Texas and west of the west coast of Florida the Gulf of America, because they insist on calling it what everybody else in the world has called it for over 100 years, the Gulf of Mexico. And they insist on keeping that in the Associated Press style guide. They have, the Associated Press reporters have been banned from the White House, and it is just incredibly petty. And yeah, I mean, they have, the Trump administration has decided that they have the right to curate who is part of the Washington press pool, which has never been the case, right? So I remember very clearly
did that.
Well, I remember very clearly during George W. Bush's presidency when this reporter from UPI insisted on asking, who traditionally, I can't remember, Helen something or other, who traditionally always asked the first question. Helen Thomas, who asked the first question at press conferences, and she had the temerity to ask a difficult question. And then they didn't kick her out of the room, but they moved her to the back, and they wouldn't recognize her to ask the question. And the entire press corps, both liberal and conservative, mainstream and fringe organizations, all rose up as a body to protest against that. And so, what we're seeing now is just, one news organization after another just genuflecting, just bowing the head to the Trump administration. And they're not acting in solidarity to protest the expulsion of the Associated Press. I mean, the Associated Press has brought a lawsuit, but they're not acting in concert to push back against what the Trump administration is doing, which is sad.
We have to wrap up here, but it's funny you brought up the Helen Thomas example, because one of the things I was thinking while we were talking today about particularly higher ed and media, sort of indirectly about the Democratic Party. There was a lot of ground ceded over the last 40 years to make Trump possible. And Helen Thomas is an interesting example of that, because the press did rally around her when she couldn't ask the first question, but they didn't rally around her when she was effectively canceled for asking critical questions of
Right.
Israel. And maybe if we had done something back then, we wouldn't be in this situation. And that's a comment that goes to the media, the Democrats, and the university system. I want to thank you guys both for being on the Disinfo Detox. Certainly going to have you guys back, because unfortunately, I think the hypocrisy and contradictions will continue. Check out Robin Andersen's work and Steve Macek's work. They are the best. I've had the pleasure of working with them. And thank you very much for tuning in to the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks for tuning in. You can find Disinfo Detox on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Every click helps grow the community and keeps those tech overlords happy. Detox complete.